Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here. And first disclosure, I did come here by public transport, over 50 miles, but I did make it on time. When I was having the planning meetings for this event, I was asked by the WHEB team, who've been absolutely fabulous, is there anything particularly I want? And I said, no, I'm pretty low maintenance. The only thing I asked for is, can we just make sure the room isn't too warm? And I can tell you on the basis of that, this group delivers. Look, I want to cover two themes today in my remarks, and then I think we'll have a Q&A so we can explore some more of these. The first is the role of businesses and markets in delivering climate action and how that actually fits into these global negotiations that take place every year between governments. And secondly, given that we are literally a couple of days away from COP28 in Dubai, a little preview of what I think we hope might happen there and what the expectations are. But the one thing I can tell you is that there will be a big business and finance presence at COP28, and some of you may well be going yourselves. But I want to take you back first to Glasgow, to COP26, just over 2 years ago. And you will recall that, as George said, we were in the ravages of COVID. Our economies were incredibly stretched because we had to deal with the impact in terms of supporting lives and livelihoods, and as business secretary, that was something that I was certainly very focused on. And of course, we also had a deteriorating geopolitics going into Glasgow, which unfortunately got a lot worse with Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But despite that, under the UK's presidency, we managed to get almost 200 countries to sign up to the Glasgow Climate Pact. Now, with all of those differences, you ask the question, well, how do we manage to do this? I think it was primarily an issue of collective self-interest. I went to 54 countries during the time that I had the COP role, many of them twice, some of them 3 times, some of them even 4 times, to try and persuade governments to act and to do more. And the one thing that they all understood was the impact of a changing climate on their own populations, on the lives, the livelihoods, the infrastructure in their own countries. And that is why I believe they decided to act on this collective issue. And the other thing that governments clearly understood as well is that the cost of inaction is clearly far greater than the cost of action. And that ultimately climate change does not recognize borders. So George was very kind in talking about COP26. And yes, actually, in terms of what we got over the line, it was a lot more than very many people expected when we first set off on this journey. We managed to get countries to come forward with more stronger commitments on cutting emissions in the near term by 2030, more finance on the table, particularly to support developing nations adapting to the climate change that they're already experiencing. We managed to go from 30% of the global economy covered by a net zero target to over 90%. Just about every single G20 country signed up to net zero. For those of you who sort of follow these things in details, you know that in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. It was a framework agreement about how countries should work together. And we managed at COP26 to sign off those final detailed rules around the Paris rulebook. And yes, there was a struggle on language on coal at the very end. But for the first time in 26 COPs, we did manage to get language on coal in the text, phase down of coal. And up until that morning, I can tell you, there were people texting me saying, you've had a good try, you will never get language on coal in the text. But we did, we persevered, and we managed to get that done. And our ambition going into the COP was to be able to say at the end of it that we had kept alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is what was agreed by countries in Paris as part of the Paris Agreement to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And at the end of this process, the International Energy Agency totted up all the commitments that were made, including those net zero commitments by countries. And they concluded that if all of those commitments were delivered upon, we were heading towards 1.8 degrees of global warming. Not 1.5, 1.8. Even at 1.5, it is going to be a really incredibly challenging impact on billions of people around the world. So I'm not saying that this is an issue for celebration, but if you look at the arc of the temperature curve moving down, before Paris, the scientists were telling us we were heading towards 4 degrees, post-Paris 3 degrees, post-Glasgow below 2 degrees. But at the time, I described this as a fragile win. And I said 1.5 was on life support. And the reason for saying that, one thing to make commitments, the other is for governments to actually deliver. So where are we now over 2 years on? Well, we're at 1.2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. We've had the hottest year on record. Those warning signs keep coming. You see that on your screens, in your papers, just about every day from a different part of the world. Earlier this year, the World Meteorological Organization put out a report working together with our Met Office, which said that on the balance of probabilities, we will breach 1.5 degrees in one of the next 5 years. Now, that may be temporary, but it gives you some idea of where this world is heading unless we act. And there was a report that the UN put out just in the last few days, which, I mean, the summary of it was, unless we get this thing under control, we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees. So it is the case that the pulse of 1.5 remains weak. It is in danger of ebbing away. And I want to come back to this when I talk about what we hope the world might do at COP28. So turning to the business community, you know, COP26 is regarded by very many as the first business COP. And I'm actually really proud of that, because we set out as a UK team to ensure that not only do we get to grips with these incredibly vital negotiations between countries and governments, but we also ensured that the business community was there in force. You know, governments set policies, it's businesses who end up having to deliver a lot of this. You know, I know from the work that I did talking to businesses and governments around the world, there are G20 countries where the business community was ahead of the government and actually pulled it along. And I think it is the case, and I saw this from talking to businesses around the world, is that they have recognized, many of them, that the pursuit of a net zero economy is an economic opportunity. They understand that if you do this right, it's good for the bottom line. It's what clients want, it's what customers want, it's what employees want. You know, I have 2 young daughters, 22 and 24. For them, the sort of organizations that they want to work for needs to align with their values. And the same will be the case for organizations like yours and across the country. And so that is why it's vitally important, if you want to attract talent, is to focus on this particular issue. So what were the commitments that we got out of business? Well, let me list a few of what happened and we agreed at COP26. We had over 5,000 international companies sign up to the UN's Race to Zero campaign, science-based targets to net zero by 2050. That number has grown to over 8,000. We had the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero, $130 trillion of assets committing to net zero. And you know, some of you may well be members through some of the bodies that are part of GFANZ. We had financial institutions which pledged to eliminate investments and activities linked to deforestation. We had financial institutions which committed to halt overseas fossil fuel investment. We had some of the biggest automakers in the world, Ford, GM, Volvo, signing up to ensuring that all new car sales in established auto markets by 2035 would be low-emission vehicles, and by 2040 in other auto markets. We got the First Movers Coalition going. There's a bunch of big international companies committing to use their purchasing power to help decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. And just picking up on this point that Jane was making on financial reporting, we also had the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, which approved a new International Sustainability Standards Board. And this, for me, is really important. You know, look, I'm an accountant. Some of you are accountants. This sort of stuff makes your heart miss a beat. It may not for everyone, but the reality is that if we can get to a point where we have comparability, we have consistency, and we have reliance on the disclosures that are being made by companies on climate and sustainability issues, we will absolutely make progress. So, I can proudly say that we did establish COP26 as the first business COP ever. So just moving on to COP28, which starts in a couple of days in Dubai. Now, one of the things that the COP President-designate, Dr. Salman Jabbar, said some months ago is that he wanted to ensure that the single North Star of COP28 was to keep 1.5 alive. That is what we set out to do. And I can tell you that since COP26, when I was still in government, I was involved in multilateral discussions and negotiations with other countries where some of them looked to try and move away from this goal. So I'm pleased that that's been restated. But the exam question here for COP28 is that how do we do that? How do we keep 1.5 alive? And remember, to do this, we need to globally cut emissions by over 40% by 2030. So I think there are going to be two pillars to the outcomes at COP28. The first will be a negotiated outcome, that agreement amongst all the countries coming together. And the second will be what the UAE defines as their action agenda. Companies, countries, setting out a whole bunch of other commitments as well that they will sign up to. One of the agreements that we reached as part of the Paris Agreement is that on a regular basis, the world would take stock. What did we promise? Where are we? Are we on target to keep 1.5 alive? Well, we've just had the first global stock take where countries have come together. And look, there's been some progress. We've seen a big push on renewables across the world. The price of wind and solar has come down significantly over the last 10 years. All the new power capacity, if you take that into account, that was added in the last year, of that 80%, over 80% was renewables. And the expectation is that over the next few years, when you look at electricity generation globally, we will be in a position where the majority of that comes from renewable sources. So there's been progress on that. Electric vehicles. In 2017, 1 in 70 new car sales in the world were EVs. This year, they're expected to be 1 in 5. So there are areas where we've seen the world move forward with technology supported by investments from organizations that you represent. But the reality is that we are still way off track. And so a key part of that negotiated agreement is going to be, how do countries get back on track? And for me, what's really important is, yes, you make your 2050 emissions reduction targets, but what are you going to do in the short term? What are you going to do in 2030, by 2035? What are you going to do across individual sectors? That is what we need to get some answers on at COP28. And then we will have a bunch of themes that will run through the negotiated outcome and the action agenda. Clean energy will be one, where countries, I hope, will commit to tripling the amount of renewables capacity globally, doubling the amount of energy efficiency, more hydrogen, less methane emissions, and we will see more corporates joining, I hope, the First Movers Coalition. Finance, which is what, of course, matters to very many people here as well. I think we will see announcements on more public and private finance mobilization, and we do need to go from the billions to the trillions. To be able to decarbonize the global economy, it's estimated we're going to need around $125 trillion of assets, and that has to come forward at these sort of conferences. We'll see commitments on nature, on food, on water, on health, funding for climate technologies, and I think you will see a whole range of deals and announcements announced on everything from finance to technology to agriculture. And the issue here is that the decisions that governments make in these sort of forums, of course, they end up being translated into domestic targets, domestic policy, and that impacts business. One of the other big issues that will be debated at this COP is the future of fossil fuels. Now, I'm one of those people who believes that we're going to have to see a transition. This isn't about turning the taps off overnight. I don't think that's realistic. But given that 75% of global emissions are energy related, we have to, as a world, address this particular issue. At the same time as we're talking about increasing renewables capacity, we need to make sure that we're talking about reducing the production of fossil fuels. And we tried at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. 80 countries, including the UK, pushed hard for language on this. It didn't happen. I hope that we will get language on phase out of fossil fuel. And it's certainly the case that the G7, of which the UK is a part, agreed language on phase out of unabated fossil fuels as well. The final thing I just want to say is that these negotiations are incredibly complex. And it is a little bit like playing a game of Jenga. It just needs one country to walk away, and the whole thing falls apart. And we had that almost at the end of COP28, where China and India weren't prepared to go with the original language on coal. And so, I, together with Shi Zhenhua from China, Minister Yadav from India, John Kerry and Frans Timmermans had to basically go behind the curtain and thrash this thing out. And the geopolitics is a lot worse. But I do think COP28 is going to be a test of the multilateral system and whether or not world leaders are prepared to act, whether they will rise above the rhetoric of their speeches and actually deliver. I hope they will, because unless they do, I'm afraid the world is going to be in an incredibly challenging place. Thank you.
Let's start off by talking about money in the system. We talked about the role of finance. And we often talk about the need to mobilize trillions of dollars into climate action. So what's missing at the moment to mobilize finance at real scale?
Yes, so look, I think, this money has to come primarily from the private sector. It is not going to come from the public sector. But the public money, the multilateral development banks have a role to play in terms of pump priming this money. And we have a new president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga. He's very focused on this issue. That the mission of the World Bank has been tweaked, so it effectively takes into account climate. And he has set up a private sector lab, bringing together the CEOs, some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, so that they can come up with solutions as to how do you get private money flowing in. There is clearly a wall of capital. We've got that in GFANZ. And we've seen some of that coming forward with the Just Energy Transition partnerships that we've announced for a number of developing countries in recent years. But I think some of the things that we need to see, apart from the MDB sweating their balance sheets more, is products like first loss. If you're a private sector organization, you want to ensure first there are investable projects, but secondly that you are going to get a return. And just one other point on this is that these Just Energy Transition partnerships that we've launched for South Africa, for Vietnam, for Indonesia, and for other countries, it is about public money then being matched with private sector money. And one of the things that I think we are trying to do through these processes is to ensure that we support those developing nations with ensuring that their regulatory environment is in a position where, when the private sector looks at this, they go, yes, I can invest, I will be able to get some money out of this.
Which needs certainty, or needs visibility, needs stability. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in that context, looking at the UK and stability and certainty, what aspects do you think we are world leading in? What aspects are at risk? And where can we accelerate progress? I mean, obviously we're in a sort of slightly fraught and live environment on the UK politics side, but.
Well, look, historically, we have been a leader in this, and we are seen as that. The past 30 years through successive governments, we've managed to grow our economy by about sort of 80% in terms of GDP growth, and also cut emissions by almost 50%. So and if you look at the offshore wind sector, we've built the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world in a really short period of time. And we've used a revenue mechanism called the Contracts for Difference auction process to allow the private sector to invest. The government's committed to putting £20 billion into carbon capture and storage. And when I was business secretary, one of the things we did was to launch a 10-point plan for what we described as a green industrial revolution, ensuring that across every sector, we were able to decarbonize and also get private sector money in. And that has been happening. But there is an issue here, which is that if you want the private sector to invest, you have to be long-term. in terms of the policy signals that you send. We have seen some chopping and changing in recent months. I've been pretty vocal on that, as indeed has, for instance, been the auto sector, who were the ones who faced some of these challenges.
A bit of a role reversal in a way. Yeah. Absolutely. So there is, there's a challenge between the short-termism and the long-termism. There's, I guess, inherent sometimes in politics and political systems in terms of, whoever wins the next election, how do we stay the course? It seems extraordinary that an issue like ULEZ in one constituency in the UK can almost seem to shape new party policy.
Well, I think on ULEZ, I think there was a misinterpretation of basically what the electorate was saying. But look, the good news is that we've got net zero by 2050 enshrined in law. Mm-hmm. We've got our near-term carbon budgets enshrined in law. So whoever is in government is going to have to keep to that. But I think it's worth pointing out that actually, as I said, the cost of inaction is way greater than the cost of action. In fact, the OBR estimated in a risk report last year that unmitigated climate change will lead to national debt rising to almost 300% of GDP by the end of the century. And not only is that unsustainable, but I can tell you as a fiscally responsible conservative, that is not a legacy that I want to leave for my kids or indeed for future generations. So, governments have to act. But what they also, and I think what the issue with ULEZ also showed is that the public believes in this issue. All the polling shows that doesn't matter what their political stripes, they care about the environment, they care about climate change, but they also need support, right? And we've seen this with grants to buy EVs, money to get people to take on heat pumps. And I just make one point on this where a lot of the time governments will say, we haven't got money, right? The computer says no. In the 6 months to March this year, the government spent £40 billion of taxpayers' money on supporting households and businesses with the cost of fuel bills. Now, that was the right thing to do, absolutely the right thing to do. But that was a one-off. Just imagine if we'd invested £40 billion in helping insulation in homes and businesses. We'd help people to upgrade their heating systems. Not only would they now be facing lower bills, but we would also be in a position where there would be less emissions. So this is about long-term thinking that governments need to be doing.
Yeah, that's really true. I remember Paul Polman once a great comment that he made that the cost we suffer from from not achieving each of the SDGs is greater than the cost of achieving all of the SDGs. Absolutely. Which is just trying to match the timeframes. So you talk a lot about the role of business, and there's clearly, a business is leading or is a government's leading. We need governments to create the framework and the environment in which businesses can operate and have some certainty. So I think it's uncontentious that policymakers need to be doing more to advance the agenda. Who do you think is leading?
So actually, I think there are a number of things that governments want. They obviously want sort of long-term policy signals and certainty. They want a regulatory environment that they know is going to be stable. And by the way, I think we do have that in the UK with our legally binding commitments. And actually, as I said, just as you want to incentivize individuals, you also need to incentivize a business. And the Inflation Reduction Act, when it first came in, there was a lot of international commentary where people weren't entirely happy. My personal view on the Inflation Reduction Act is that it is a brilliant piece of industrial strategy. It is about getting private sector investment into the US. It is about reshoring. It is about jobs. It is about building the industries of the future. And you've seen it working. Over the last year, about $200 billion of private sector investment has flowed in on the back of the Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the things that I have said for some months now is that perhaps we as a government ought to be looking to see how we respond to the Inflation Reduction Act.
There seems to be a sort of divide across the pond a bit on that, but it's very illuminating in that sense. I just hope it survives the next 18 months or so?
Well, I mean, absolutely. We'll see what happens, and we've seen the sort of commentary from Mr. Trump in the last few days on the IRA. I mean, the only thing I would say is that a lot of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act has, of course, been flowing to Republican states as well.
Yes.
You know, jobs and investment. So I think, you know, whoever gets into power, if it is the Republicans, will have to think very carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of questions coming through around COP28, and you've spoken a bit about it. And, but so, do you think there's there's a lot of skepticism about it that we've seen in the last couple of days? We were talking earlier about some of the news that's come out over the last couple of days that sort of, you know, is sort of creates a bit of sort of caution about the expectations there. But are COP processes really fit for purpose? You know, trying to get 192 countries to sign up to one agreement, is that always going to mean that you're going to get to the lowest common denominator? Or is there other ways of dealing with it?
Well, so I can tell you, they are very frustrating trying to get. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you guys, but at Christmas, trying to get the family to agree on one movie is difficult enough. But trying to get almost 200 countries to agree. But that is the process that we have, and I've thought about this a lot, whether you can somehow change this. But the COP process, I think, is just about the only time where countries like Palau and Malawi will get to sit at the same table and look in the eye the US and China. And it matters, and I think the political signals that come out of these COP processes is really important, and they do feed into what happens domestically and then how sort of businesses interact as well. Frustrating though they are, I think it is a process that we have to persevere with. It's what we have. As I said, if you look at what has happened over the past few years, that temperature curve has bent downwards. Not fast enough, but it is bent downwards, and we just need to keep going faster at this. I mean, it's a question of pace and delivery here.
In terms of the COP process, I'm fascinated because I came to Glasgow, and it was an extraordinary scene because you've got this big fence basically around everything that's going on, and then there's a lot happening outside the fence as well. And I was interested. I mean, you had big marches with Greta Thunberg coming around, buying down the street, etc. But you had these big wire fences and a lot of security to get in. The dynamic between what's outside the room and what's inside the room. And as I mentioned, there's a number of questions about the news coming out. There may be oil deals going on around the periphery of the conference. But how the two relate to each other. You've got this sort of negotiating centre, and then a lot of activity and noise happening around.
Yes. So, I mean, those of you who've been will know that, I mean, you have technically what is referred to as the blue zone, which is actually controlled by the UN, which is where the negotiations take place, and then the green zone, where you have, a lot of events taking place, but also organizations, talking about what they're doing in terms of decarbonization and tackling climate change. And I think in my view, I think it's a great ecosystem where you have governments, you have businesses, and very importantly, you have civil society coming together at the same time. And there is really no place to hide in these processes, because you have observers who are in the negotiating rooms. There's a lot of reporting. I mean, basically, the world's press is camped out there, as you will see again. It ends up being sort of pretty transparent as a process.
Yeah. And what about you, in a sense that you're going to step down as an MP at the end of this Parliament. What motivates you personally in your work on climate change now? What next for you, and also in your own life? I mean, I think a lot of people work in sustainability, and it's one of those areas of work where it crosses being in the office and being at home. What in your own life, how does it shape your own decision-making, your own financial decision-making?
No, absolutely it does. I mean, I've had a whole bunch of roles in government. The only one that my daughter's ever been excited about, where they texted me when they saw that I'd got this role, was COP. And, politicians talk a lot about leaving the environment in a better place than they found it for future generations. I think that's really important, and I think it's important that actually politicians, whether they are in government or backbench or whatever, actually follow through on that. And for me, this is an issue that we talk about at the dinner table. And in fact, when I got this role, my younger daughter sort of said to me, "So what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to talk to government." I said, no. What are you going to do? She is a vegan. She's been vegan since the age of 13 or 14. And she basically persuaded me that I should give up meat. Now, that's not for everyone. That's a matter of choice of what people want to do. But for me, that was important as a sort of small way of trying to make a bit of a difference. And then I think, in terms of what I do in the future, I am pretty sure that it will all be connected with climate action. I mean, I've joined the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of the sort of big philanthropies, working with them on financial reform. So I expect that I will continue to be pretty busy in this space.
Fantastic. I'm going to try and draw in some more. I've been trying to use some of the Slido questions as we've talked, but we've got a little bit of time for some audience questions, so we can take some. We've got some mics, I think, that can come down. So if we can have some mics to the front, that would be great. Whilst they're coming down, we've got a question in the front here, Laura. There are a couple of questions about about the system and whether the system is fit for purpose. And, should we be moving away from GDP as a measure to one considering externalities and planetary boundaries? All insights are framed within the current paradigm. Won't climate change drive massive social and political economic upheaval over the coming years? So is the current system that we operate in, does it need tweaking, does it need adjusting, or does it need more significant change in order to deliver and address the challenges we face?
If there was one thing that I could do and basically wave a magic wand, is to have a global price on carbon. If there was one thing that I could do, and actually, if we had that, and yes, we have, individual governments have emissions trading schemes, and the EU is enacting CBAMs, and we'll see what the UK does and others do. But if we had a global price on carbon, money would actually flow to the right projects. And actually, my sort of one plea to everyone in this room is that, when you as organizations make decisions on finance, please price climate risk into everything that you do. And if literally the world started doing that, you would see money flowing really quickly into the right areas to tackle climate change and bring about a better world.
Great. We've got a question from the front.
A very, very good presentation by yourself in this whole space. Is there a parliamentary group, an APPG, in COP as an environmental area? And if so, what areas have they been exploring with the blue economy, which is predominantly based around oceanic issues on pollution in the sea?
Yeah. So there are a significant number of APPGs, as you know, and in fact we will have a sort of cross-party representation going to the COP, I think during the second week. And they do cover issues around the environment, around the blue economy, looking at issues like blue bonds. And as some of you will be aware, there are a number of COPs. So we've got the climate COP, there's a biodiversity COP, we have a desertification COP as well. And decisions made at those individual COPs also impact on the blue economy. And I suspect that we will see discussion around this issue at COP28 as well. But please rest assured, this is a cross-party issue. Within the Conservative Party, we have something called the Conservative Environmental Network, where well over 100 members of Parliament from the Parliamentary Caucus are actually members. So this is, and actually the Labour Party has something very similar, and I'm sure the Lib Dems do as well. So this is an issue that has cross-party support in Parliament.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you. Very interesting speech, I guess. I'm interested in what we do about petrochemical states, so big fossil fuel extractors as we're going to see at COP28, the guys in the Middle East, but not just there. And how do you compensate them, I suppose, for the loss that they suffer through not extracting fossil fuels anymore? And I know you spoke about carbon, and I guess that must be part of it. But the difference is massive, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they have been making some pretty extraordinary profits over the last couple of years as well. And look, I mean, this goes back to the point I made about price on carbon. If we had a price on carbon, then actually a lot of this discussion would become sort of very live, if I can put it like that. But the International Energy Agency brought out a report literally a few days ago where they basically said that we, right now, if you look at the oil and gas sector, 2.5% of what they earn goes into renewables. That needs to rise to around 50%. There is a international decarbonisation alliance, which has been sort of being put together by the UAE as the COP presidency, bringing together some of the national oil and gas companies, some of the investor-led oil and gas companies, and let's see what commitments they actually make. But I mean, my view is very clear, is that one, we have to tackle reductions in fossil fuel production if we're going to have any hope of basically keeping the sort of world that we want. Secondly, I'm afraid I don't buy into this thing that carbon capture is going to somehow solve everything. It's not, right? I mean, the reality is that there are not enough projects out there currently, and actually the price of this technology has not been coming down at pace. And thirdly, and the IEA has made this point, that this is a moment of truth at COP28 for the oil and gas sector. And the UAE is uniquely positioned as an oil and gas state to bring them together. We'll see what conclusions they reach.
Do you think there's a risk that governments have delegated too much of their responsibilities to finance and the rest of the private sector? So letting, if you like, loose law and non-financial regulation abound, so that, in a sense, finance is asked to do too much because there comes a point when it's not our job?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really interesting point. And one of the things that I've heard from corporates, including very large corporates, is that right now there is a sort of a plethora of organizations which have come forward with sort of voluntary standards that individual sectors should be following. And that's fine. If you're a very big company, you can sort of deal with this. But if you're smaller and you don't have the resource, you won't be able to. So one of the things that I have heard from the business community is, almost for governments to mandate and to say, right, this is what we require. And by the way, we didn't get onto the discussion about the US and green hushing and all the rest of it. But actually, where you are being, as a corporate, being challenged in certain jurisdictions by, sub-state level, in the US, for instance, some of the states have raised issues, the attorney generals have raised issues about what the investment community has been doing. To be able to say, no, this is what we're required by the federal government to do, I think that's really important. I think we're starting to get there, but again, it's a question of pace.
Brilliant. I'm afraid, the misery of my role in this is I've got to try and keep people marginally to time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Sir Alok, and thank you very much for your time, your insights, and for being so open with the audience. And thank you very much.